Welcome back, Deep Divers. It's Season 9, and we're going deep into the world of the Syriac early church fathers.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, these are the folks who really shaped how Christianity developed in the East. Their theology, how they read the Bible, and even how they understood the whole idea of asceticism.
Yeah, it's a fascinating but often overlooked part of early church history.
Right. And to guide us through this world, we're using the fantastic work of Andrei Mubarak.
Excellent choice.
He's a teacher and tour guide based in Jerusalem.
Okay.
And get this, he's an Aramaic-speaking Christian.
Why, so cool.
I know, right? He actually teaches about the Aramaic roots of Christianity. Pretty incredible if you think about it.
Absolutely.
So if you're interested in learning more on your own, his website is www.twinsbiblicalacademy.com.
I'll have to check that out.
For sure. So today we're diving into the life and work of Narsai of Nispis, a 5th century figure who was known as the Tongue of the East.
Now that's a nickname that makes you want to learn more.
Right. He was a leading figure in the Church of the East. Oh. He headed the school of Nisibis, which was this really important center of learning. He wrote tons of these poetic homilies. They're called memorae.
Memorae.
We've got 80 of them that still survive today.
80? Wow, that's a lot of material.
It is a serious body of work covering everything from Old Testament stories to the parables of Jesus, and even diving into some of the really heated theological debates of his time.
So he wasn't afraid to tackle the tough issues.
It sounds like he wasn't. But before we get into all of that, let's start with Narsai the man. What was his life like?
Well, picture this. Narsai is orphaned at a young age. He's raised by a monk, and then he goes on to excel at the school of Edessa, another one of these intellectual hubs.
Okay, so he's already off to a pretty dramatic start.
He is, but it gets even more intense because he ends up getting caught in some major theological disputes and is forced to flee Edessa.
Wow, so these theological disagreements back then were really serious business.
Oh, absolutely. Not just academic debates. Yeah. People had strong feelings and they were willing to act on them.
So where does Narsai go after he has to leave Edessa?
Exile takes him to Nisibis, and you know what? He ends up founding a school there.
No way.
Yeah, and it becomes even more influential than the one he left behind.
That's incredible. Talk about resilience.
It makes you wonder if maybe all that upheaval actually fueled his creativity and his drive.
Right. Like it gave him this new sense of purpose.
Definitely. And it's important to remember the context here. He was living through a really tumultuous period for the church.
Oh, right. The 5th century.
Exactly. You've got all these major councils happening, like Ephesus and Chalcedon.
And those were trying to figure out Christology, right?
Yeah.
Like understanding who Jesus is.
Exactly. And these councils caused some serious divisions in the church because people had very strong opinions about the answers to these questions.
I can imagine.
Narsai was right in the middle of all of this.
So let's go back to his memoir for a minute, these poetic homilies.
Okay.
Were they like sermons that we might hear in church today?
Not exactly. Think of it more as a blend of poetry, storytelling, and theological teaching all woven together. Yeah. They had this rhythm and beauty that really resonated with people. It helped to make complex ideas more accessible and memorable.
That makes sense. I mean, we all remember things better when they're part of a good story.
Exactly.
So we've got Narsai, this gifted poet and a deep theological thinker. Did he stick to the safe topics in his work, or did he get into some of the more controversial stuff?
He definitely wasn't afraid of controversy. Remember all that debate about Christology that we were just talking about?
Yes.
Well, Narsai actually wrote a memoir praising Nestorius.
Wait a minute, Nestorius? Wasn't he condemned by the Western Church for his views on Christ?
That's the one, but Narsai clearly felt that Nestorius had something important to say, even if others disagreed.
Interesting. So he was willing to go against the grain.
Absolutely. It shows us his independence and how he wasn't just following the crowd.
That takes guts, especially back then. So we've got Narsai, the poet-theologian, navigating this world of intense theological debate. What were some of his core ideas, and how do they shape how he understood the Bible?
Well, he was really influenced by what's called the Antiochene school of thought.
Okay.
And especially the work of Theodore of Mopsuestia, a scholar who was known as the interpreter.
Okay, I've heard of him.
They really emphasize a more literal and historical approach to interpreting the scriptures.
So not reading too much symbolism into every detail.
Right, more like what does the text actually say?
Okay, got it.
And for Narsai, that was really crucial. Understanding the plain meaning of the text was the foundation. And then from there, you could draw out the moral and theological implications.
So it was a very grounded approach.
Yeah, very grounded in contrast to the more allegorical style favored by some other thinkers at the time.
Can you give us an example of how this worked in Narsai's work?
Sure, think about his homilies on the flood and the tabernacle. He wasn't afraid to explore the symbolism in those stories, but he always kept it rooted in the concrete details of the biblical narrative.
So it's like he was building a bridge between the literal and the symbolic, making sure both had their place.
Exactly. It's a hallmark of his style and a reflection of those Antiochean roots.
That's fascinating, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, this brings us to one of the most important topics of Narsai's time, Christology, right? Understanding who Jesus is and how his divine and human natures fit together.
Exactly. And remember, those councils were really wrestling with this.
Right. So where did Narsai stand on all of this?
Narsai was a strong supporter of what we call the diophysite position.
Okay.
It means he affirmed that Christ has two full natures, divine and human, united in the one person of Christ.
So two natures distinct but united. How did he explain that? Because it sounds pretty complex.
Well, Narsai was a very skilled debater. He used both scripture and logic to argue his case.
Okay.
And he wasn't even afraid to directly challenge Cyril of Alexandria, a major proponent of miaphysitism, the idea of a single unified nature in Christ.
Yeah.
He just kept hammering home this point that Christ was fully God and fully man, with each nature retaining its unique properties, even within the unity of his person.
So he was walking this tightrope, trying to hold those two natures together without blending them into one.
Precisely. And it's a delicate balance.
It is. Did he ever give specific examples of how this worked out in practice?
Yeah, one interesting example is how careful he was when talking about Mary as Theotokos, the God-bearer.
Oh, wait.
He affirmed her honor for sure, but he preferred to call her the mother of Christ to avoid any suggestion that Christ's divine nature came from Mary.
Interesting.
It's subtle, but it shows how much thought he put into every single word.
Yeah, you can really see the nuance in his thinking.
Absolutely, and this is what made him such a powerful theologian. He didn't shy away from these tough questions, and he really tried to get to the heart of what it meant to be both fully God and fully human.
It's amazing to think about how one person's ideas can have such a ripple effect. Did his influence spread beyond just his own writing?
Oh, definitely through the school of Nisibis, Narsai really solidified the Antiochean tradition within the Church of the East.
It's like he planted a seed that grew into something much bigger.
Exactly, and that's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive.
I can't wait. This has already been such an eye-opening look into the world of Narsai and the Syriac early church.
Agreed, there's so much to discover here.
And don't forget, all of this amazing research comes from Andrei Mobarak. Be sure to visit his website, www.twinsbiblicalacademy.com, for more insights into the world of the Aramaic-speaking Christians. So we've been talking about Narsai, this poet theologian who's wrestling with these big questions about Christ. But his influence goes way beyond just those Christological debates.
Oh, yeah, definitely. His theological vision was much broader than that. He had a lot to say about how God is at work in the world and what that means for us, how we should live our lives.
So not just this abstract theological stuff, but it's about how faith plays out in the real world.
Exactly. One of the big themes that really jumps out at you in Narsai's work is his emphasis on God's providence.
Providence.
Yeah, this idea that God is actively involved in guiding and directing history, and not in some distant way, but right down to the nitty-gritty details of our lives.
So not just this clockmaker God who sets everything in motion and then steps back.
No, not at all. For Narsai, God is intimately involved with creation, constantly working things out according to his wisdom and goodness, even when things look chaotic or messy. Narsai saw God's hand at work, both in the big picture and in the lives of individuals.
Did he use examples from the Bible to kind of illustrate this idea?
Oh, tons of them. He loved to draw on stories from the Old Testament, particularly the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all these stories where they're making mistakes and facing challenges, but God's plan keeps unfolding through it all.
Yeah, those are really powerful stories. And if God can guide those guys through all that drama, maybe there's hope for us too.
That's exactly what Narsai wanted people to see, that they weren't alone in their struggles, that God was with them, just as God had been with those figures from the past. And this wasn't just some feel-good message for Narsai. Understanding God's providence was supposed to lead to a changed life.
So it wasn't just about knowing the right things, but actually doing them too.
Exactly. He put a huge emphasis on holiness, this idea that the more we know God, the more we should become like God.
Okay.
And he constantly emphasized virtues like humility, charity, and obedience.
Were there any specific practices that he recommended for people to kind of develop those virtues?
Well, remember, he grew up in this monastic setting, so he had a deep respect for the ascetic life. Practices like prayer and fasting, simplifying your life to focus on the spiritual.
It's interesting how those practices are still pretty popular even today. Outside of monasteries, people are trying minimalism or being more intentional about what they consume.
Mm.
So that they're searching for a way to create space in their lives for something more.
That's a great point, and Narsai would have totally agreed with you for him. These ascetic practices weren't about punishing yourself. They were about clearing away the clutter, both the physical and the mental clutter, so that you could be more open to God's grace.
So did he think everyone should go live in a monastery?
Not necessarily. He recognized that not everyone's called to that specific kind of life, but he believed that the principles behind those practices, self-discipline, simplicity, focusing on what really matters, those could apply to any vocation, any walk of life.
So it's like having this kind of monastic mindset, even if you're living in the world.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that inner stillness, that detachment from worldly things, even amidst all the busyness and distractions of daily life.
Which is so hard these days.
It is, but it's something that we can definitely learn from Narsai.
Okay, so we've got God's providence, we've got this call to holiness, and this idea of kind of everyday asceticism. Is there anything else we should mention before we move on?
Yes. One more crucial piece of Narsai's theological vision is his understanding of the church. For him, the church wasn't just a building or an institution. It was the community of the redeemed. It was the continuation of Israel's story. The new people of God gathered from all nations.
So deeply rooted in the Old Testament, but also something new and transformative.
Exactly. And he really stressed the importance of unity within the church, which is really interesting given the context. He was living in a time of intense theological debates and division, even schisms.
Right, all those arguments about the nature of Christ.
But despite all that disagreement, Narsai really believed that the church should strive for harmony and love.
And that's such a relevant message even today, right? Like,
Yeah.
how do we maintain unity amidst all the different perspectives and opinions in the world?
It's a challenge. It's always been a challenge. So did he offer any practical advice on how to actually achieve that kind of unity?
Right, because it's easy to say, oh, we should all be unified, but how do we get there?
Well, he constantly emphasized the importance of humility, forgiveness, putting the good of the community ahead of your own personal interests.
Okay, so not exactly easy stuff.
He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he believed that it was possible.
Those are some values that seem to be in short supply these days. It's almost like we've lost the art of disagreeing well.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
But I think Narsai would remind us that it's not just about human effort. He saw God's grace and the work of the Holy Spirit as essential for bringing about true unity. It's like there's this divine element at play, drawing people together even when they mess things up.
That's a hopeful thought.
It is, and it brings us back to that theme of God's providence.
Mm-hmm.
Narsai believed that even when humans fall short, God is still working to bring his people together. It's like this thread of hope that runs through all his work, even the difficult stuff.
I love that image. It's like even in the midst of exile and theological debates, all the challenges of his time, Narsai never loses sight of God's bigger purpose for the church.
Exactly. He saw the potential for something beautiful and powerful, even when things looked really messy, and that vision continues to inspire people even today.
Wow, this has been an incredibly rich discussion about Narsai's theological vision. I feel like I'm starting to really understand why he was such a powerful and influential figure. He wasn't just arguing about these abstract concepts. He was really grappling with the real stuff of what it means to live a faithful life in a complicated world.
And there's still more to uncover in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore how Narsai's legacy lived on, shaping the Church of the East for centuries to come.
I'm ready. Let's keep diving in. All right, so we've talked about Narsai's life, his poetry, his ideas, but what about his legacy? What happened after he was gone?
Well, his impact was huge. I mean, it continues to this day. Remember how he founded that school of Nisibis after having to flee Edessa?
Yeah.
Well, that school became a major center for theological education, drawing in students and scholars from all over.
So it's like he planted a seed that kept growing even after he wasn't around anymore.
That's a great way to put it. And the fruit from that seed really nourished the church for centuries. The school outlived Narsai by hundreds of years. And it became this key place for preserving and passing on his teachings, especially his ideas about biblical interpretation and his particular take on Christology.
So it wasn't just about memorizing Narsai's words. They were taking his ideas and applying them in new ways, right?
Exactly. And that's where figures like Baba the Great come in. He was a 7th century theologian who took that diophysite Christology that Narsai championed and developed it even further. He built on those foundations, making sure that this understanding of Christ remained central to the Church of the East.
So Narsai's legacy wasn't just about holding on to the past. It was about sparking new ideas and adapting to new situations.
Right. Narsai gave later generations a framework for thinking through these complicated issues. His focus on clarity, reason, and grounding theological reflection in the scriptures that became a model for other theologians as they tried to figure out and articulate their own faith.
It's like he gave them a set of tools to use.
Yeah, a toolbox for tackling the big questions. And it wasn't just for scholars and theologians. Remember those we talked about those beautiful poetic homilies?
Yeah.
Well, those continued to be used in worship services long after Narsai died. They shaped the spirituality of Eastern Christians for generations.
So his poetry wasn't just for intellectual debate. It had this real, tangible impact on people's faith.
Absolutely. Those memoirs were more than just words. They were sung and prayed and experienced by everyday believers. They brought comfort, inspiration, and a deeper understanding of God. And that's a testament to how powerful and enduring his work really was.
I mean, it's incredible to think about how one person's writing could have such a lasting impact on an entire community's way of life.
It is pretty amazing. So we've got this incredible legacy, the school later theologians like Babai, and then these memoirs that kept being used in worship. But is that the end of the story, or did his influence extend even further?
Yeah, I'm curious to hear where else this goes.
Well, Narsai is still considered a saint and doctor of the church in several Eastern Christian traditions today, including the Assyrian Church of the East and the Chaldean Catholic Church.
Wow.
His writings are still studied and cherished as sources of wisdom and guidance.
So even though he lived way back in the 5th century, his ideas still resonate with people today.
They do, and I think that's important for us to remember. It reminds us that the church has always been this tapestry of different voices and perspectives.
And that we can learn from those who came before us.
Yeah.
Even if we don't agree with them on every single point, right?
Absolutely. There's so much to be gained from engaging with different traditions, and that's what makes exploring figures like Narsai so enriching.
Yeah, it opens up this whole world.
It does. We get a glimpse into the richness and the complexity of Christian history and thought, and we realize that these ancient debates, they're still relevant today as we wrestle with these same fundamental questions about faith, life, and the nature of God.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Narsai of Nisibis, we've seen him as this incredible poet, this fearless defender of his convictions, a teacher who shaped generations, and ultimately a figure whose legacy continues to inspire and challenge us even today.
And if you want to learn more about this fascinating world of the Syriac early church, all this research comes from the amazing work of Andrei Mubarak. He's a teacher and a tour guide in Jerusalem and an Aramaic-speaking Christian, which makes his perspective all the more valuable.
Definitely be sure to check out his website at www.twinsbiblicalacademy.com. You won't be disappointed. And as for our listeners, we leave you with this thought. Narsai's story shows us that even in the face of exile and controversy and all the challenges that life throws at us, ideas have this power to endure and to shape the course of history. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the rich tapestry of Christian thought.
There's always something new to discover.